The House resumes its sitting. Please be seated. When we took the luncheon adjourn break, I think the member from Town West and the move of the motion had completed his introduction. May I call now on any other member to speak? Any other member wishing to speak at this time? The Honorable the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the member from Town West and the seconder for bringing this motion forward. As the member rightly knows, Mr. Speaker, we have had numerous amounts of conversations over the past few years. This is something that I campaigned on, and free health care for children. And the government has been discussing this since we've been in office, since 2017, trying to find a way forward. I must admit, we do have a team and the ministry looking at these proposals already, including seniors, 65, and the possibility of free health care for children, and also the possibility of a national health care plan. We have a company that we've been working with over the past few years, and they have actually met with caucus now a few times, and I've met with them a few times, trying to figure out how the government can find a way forward to afford what some may call free. Mr. Speaker, in saying this, I will comment further. The motion brought free health care for children, and it's currently being discussed by my ministry. The World Health Organization recommends the introduction of primary health care services by all countries through their alma mater declaration of 1978, which states that primary health care is essential health based on practical, scientifically sound, and socially acceptable methods and technologies made universally accessible to individuals and families in the community through their full participation and at costs that the country and community can afford, which is very important. Mr. Speaker, I believe that we should ensure that health care is accessible and affordable for all in terms of our children. The Economic and Statistics Office Spring 2018 report indicates that we have approximately 10,800 children in the under 14 years age group. Their health care costs are currently covered through a number of different channels. The health insurance legislation requires that every person resident in the islands, including children, must have at least the standard health care contract cover. In addition to this requirement, Mr. Speaker, for resident children to be compulsory insured, there are 3 annual output agreements between the ministry and the Health Services Authority to provide primary health care services at district health centers, which includes child health services and immunizations. Medical care beyond insurance coverage, uninsured, and school health services, including health education, screening, immunizations, and routine dental care. Accordingly, Mr. Speaker, there are currently mechanisms in place to facilitate children having access to health care, albeit not all for free. Mr. Speaker, the overall cost of health care in this country, as you can imagine, is already a significant amount. I believe that our children are our greatest assets, and so do the government. And the protection of their health is essential for their effective development. To that end, Mr. Speaker, the ministry has plans to undertake an assessment of the various options for creating a program that will deliver the high-quality health care that our children need and deserve at the lowest possible cost to families. Mr. Speaker, free health care is ambitious and will only be possible if an appropriate, sustainable funding mechanism is in place. We will work very hard, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, to identify the means by which we can achieve this sustainable funding mechanism to secure the healthiest possible future for our children. Mr. Speaker, this is something very near and dear to me, and caucus hears from me on a regular, reporting what the ministry is trying to achieve towards this effort. I want to thank the member again for bringing this motion forward. And the member knows full well that this is something that I intend to achieve during this 4 years. Mr. Speaker, I've seen families who, one of the reasons, Mr. Speaker, why I was so interested in campaigning on having free health care for children is because I understand what's going on out there. There are families, if we're to be honest, Mr. Speaker, there are families out there who are unemployed, lost their job, no longer hold health insurance, and this means that their children then is not covered. There are some technicalities in trying to get NAU and Synico to cover if you already have a certain amount of assets, etc. And there is some confusion out there. There are some children who are slipping through the cracks and not getting proper health care out there just because people are unemployed. So, Mr. Speaker, there are other scenarios, but I just draw that one to your attention. But our Caymanian people, we're very proud, and at times we are scared to come forward because we lost a job to beg or to ask the government to assist them with covering their children. This is just the nature of the beast, Mr. Speaker. And the government, when I was growing up, Mr. Speaker, I benefited from free health care. I remember my mother telling me, "You're getting out of school this year, so this is your final one, so we go and make sure we do a good one." So parents really benefited from that. I see a lot of savings here. There's a win-win situation here in terms of trying to find a mechanism to have free health care for our children in the Cayman Islands. The parents won't have to pay as much on their insurance policies, and all children will be strong and healthy and good contributing citizens to the society. So, Mr. Speaker, with that, I want to say that the government is willing to consider this motion brought to this honorable House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? If not, the member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, I want to applaud my colleague, the member from Town West, for bringing such a motion. And I think he gave a good foundation in his contribution to this honorable House as to the reasoning behind why we should all support this motion. I must say, Mr. Speaker, that I'm unclear as to the response by the Honorable Minister, whether the government's intention is to accept this motion. There's a difference between accepting this motion and supporting the idea of the content of the motion. Mr. Speaker, thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your indulgence. Mr. Speaker, I want to say that I think that this is a good opportunity for us to address something that the government has said a number of times that is difficult to do. And the notion of reducing the cost of living. We've heard on numerous occasions by the different members of cabinet of how that is difficult in the various different strategies. And Mr. Speaker, like the minister rightfully said, our children are our most important asset. But our children are also sometimes the most expensive expense. And of those expenses for our most important assets, coverage for them can also is one of those areas that add to the cost of living. And Mr. Speaker, if we move forward with initiative such as the member from Bontown West has suggested and such as the minister had campaigned on, I think this can be seen as one of those ways that we can assist Cayman families to taking off one burden off of their expense list and therefore increasing their disposable income to deal with the other rising cost in the country. Mr. Speaker, I think it's also important to highlight that based on risk, and I only say this based on my general knowledge as a father, that in respect, as a father, as a middle-aged man, as well as a caretaker to my parents, so the information that I have in respect to insurance cost varies from age groups. And as far as I understand, Mr. Speaker, the risk level by way of cost is most lowest with kids under the age of 14, but after the age of 1. And Mr. Speaker, as we know, adults who have children are expected to have their own insurance. So therefore, if we created legislation that suggested that health care would be free for kids, it probably would not have to cover, or their own personal insurance would cover probably the most expensive time of a child's health experience, and that would be the time of the pregnancy and just thereafter. The risk reduces tremendously after age 1 to age 14. So the initial concerns of cost is real, but relative. And Mr. Speaker, I just want to stand to say that on behalf of the people of Georgetown Central, this is something that they would welcome, as there's many families in Georgetown Central who would appreciate the freedom of knowing that if anything goes wrong, that their children will be cared for, even though things are difficult for them. So I give my full support to the member for bringing this motion, and I hope that the government and everybody in this honorable House will give it its full support. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? The Honorable Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to rise, first of all, to thank the member from Bontown West for bringing this. I can relieve the Premier of that stress. He won't have to get up to respond to me. To thank the member from Bontown West for bringing this motion. I think it is, as the minister said in his response, it is something that I think a lot of us actually supported actually trying to do, and while understanding the difficulties in achieving it. Mr. Speaker, we clearly have to balance being careful with the country's resources, with how we spend the country's resources, but we also have to balance that with looking after our people and ensuring that our people have access to the best health care that we can afford to give them. I'm glad to hear, Mr. Speaker, that the minister is in support of this motion and that he has been actually making some progress towards achieving what the motion has asked for, which is to provide free health care for children. Mr. Speaker, it is unfortunate, I think, that the member had to actually bring this motion because it says something for what some of our people are going through. And, these things aren't just thought up in a vacuum. Clearly, he has had representation made to him. He's had experiences as a representative that have sort of framed his thinking in moving in this direction, to think about providing free health care for children. Mr. Speaker, I don't think any of us are a stranger to that reality. I think as representatives, we all get those representations made to us. And I see it quite often where, families, entire families sometimes don't have access to health care simply because of the financial aspect of it. They simply can't afford health insurance, some of them. The employment factor is also an issue. I've also talked about my concerns with the varying levels of insurance that are available. And of course, these are based on price. So sometimes you end up getting, the cheapest level of coverage because that's what you can afford. Mr. Speaker, I also am concerned that what happens quite often when you think about health care is that those with the most tend to get the best. And we really don't want that situation to override our underlying concern to take care of our young people. We don't want to be a society where the most affluent get the best care. Unfortunately, that comes with a lot of mathematics and financial planning and creative thinking to be able to achieve that. Sorry, Mr. Speaker. And so just following that frame of that thought that I was having, I really don't want to see Cayman become a society where only those that can afford it get the best care. Everybody should get the best care available. And we can't let finances be an obstacle to achieving that. Mr. Speaker, I've also done quite a bit of research myself because this issue has troubled me, not just from the aspect of this private member's motion, but healthcare across the board. And I've had some conversations with healthcare providers, insurance providers, and there's a sad truth that we must face, Mr. Speaker. Healthcare is a business, and those involved in healthcare, while they want to care for people, heal people, prevent people from getting worse and becoming ill to where they can't function, or the inevitable, unfortunately, losing their lives. While all of that is a reality for us, we must also remember that doctors become doctors because they want to earn a living as a doctor. And perhaps that is an area that we need to focus on as well, because some of what my independent research has turned up is that there are areas on both sides of the coin with insurance providers and doctors where both sets of individuals can do better for this country. Mr. Speaker, we have some doctors who, while it's been sort of a ingrained thing and inbuilt thing in us that when you think of doctor, you think of someone of the highest ethics, highest moral makeup. But there are some doctors who operate unethically, and we have to face that. We do regulate them and so forth, but it's often difficult to question a physician's motives when you realize that they may have been ordering excessive tests or unnecessary procedures. But it happens. It happens. And unfortunately, fortunate for me, because I was able to sit down with a physician who talked me through some of these practices. And these are things that we don't want to face because, let's face it, who wants to accuse a doctor of being unethical? But it happens. And that's something that we have to look at. We also have to look at the other side of the coin, the insurance business, and make sure that what people are paying for premiums, they're getting good value for money and coverage. But it's a two-sided coin. It's a double-edged sword, really. I think this motion will give some relief to those families who are now struggling and concerned about providing good health care for their children. And you think about what this means to a family. If the children don't have access to health care, good health care, and even preventative health care, then what that could mean for them growing up, how it will affect their learning ability, their ability to be healthy and productive member of society. All of these things are factors we have to consider. I always look back at, or when I think about this problem, I look at some of the factors. The main factor seems to be financial. I see families now, Mr. Speaker, who, because they can't do any better, regularly feed their children fast food. And it's because when you drive into these fast food restaurants, and I'm not beating up on them, but when you see the specials that are advertised, for $5 you can get 3 burgers or whatever it is, it really is not promoting wellness in our young people, and it's making it easily available, much more easily available because of the cheap price. But then there are families who are struggling, and that is all they can afford. And then that leads to issues with childhood obesity, childhood diabetes. And I see it more often than we should. Yeah, well, I agree with the Premier. Yeah, bread kind is cheaper. But, some parents are also caught in situations where they're working late, working shifts, working sometimes 2 jobs, trying to make ends meet. And all of these factors are impacting our children. We see the surveys and the studies being done on the mental health of our young people. And I can't help but try to think, or I can't help but correlate, poor diet, poor, physical condition with poor mental well-being as well. So all of these things are interlinked. I also think about parents. I remember growing up. I think about, anytime my siblings needed something not wanted, needed, how my parents would struggle if they had to, but they would try to do their best to provide it because they wanted the best for their children. And I liken that to what our response has to be to this issue. If our children need something, and it's something that is so critical and important to the future of these young people, then let's find a way to get it done. Let's find a way to give it to them. This isn't a handout. This isn't this sense of, I must get it because I'm a Caymanian. This is about the future of this country. And we have to endeavor to give our young people the very best that we can, not what they want, but what they need. And this is one of those situations where I have to support what the member from Bordentown West is proposing, because I know it is so critical to these young people in our country. I also would like to see, and I know that there are efforts being made, but we have to do more to promote physical activity, wholesome activities, proper diet, awareness of diseases like diabetes. My family, diabetes is a problem. Many of my relatives have diabetes, close relatives as well. So while some of it may be genetic, a lot of it is determined by diet and your physical well-being. You know, we have to find ways to make sure that we drive the message home to our young people that while you can go to the doctor, most of us go to the doctor when something is wrong. What I would prefer to see is that we're going to the doctor for our annual checkup to get some good news. But all of this starts from an early age. We need to start from the very beginning, teach the good habits, the healthy habits, and make sure that our young people have that in them as they grow up, so that they understand what a good, healthy choice is when you go to eat something versus going to the fast food restaurant. But economic circumstances play a big role in this, and this is what we have to focus on. We talk about cost of living, Mr. Speaker. This is one of the ill effects of a high cost of living. When cost of living impacts the purchasing power, and you have to make choices on what bill to pay this month, how you're going to feed your children. You want to give them something to eat, you want their stomachs to be full, so you go and find something that's cheap. And unfortunately, that cheap choice may be detrimental to them in the very near future. So all we can do for young people, Mr. Speaker, I support, and I want to commend the mover of this motion and his seconder for bringing it. And obviously, I will support the motion. Thank you.
Does another member wish to speak? Does the member for Prospect?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I would like to echo the sentiments put by members who have spoken already by commending the mover and seconder of this motion for bringing this rather significant and I think very important issue to the forefront. And I believe, as the Honorable Minister responsible stated in the response on behalf of the government, certainly it is a notion that the government acknowledges is real, necessary in many quarters, and certainly important. And therefore it has agreed that it would consider the motion on the floor, but has also drawn the line at stating that though it may suggest free health care for children, it does carry a cost. The doctors that attend those children still need to be paid. The facilities in which that treatment is rendered still needs to be paid for. The equipment, the medicine, etc. All of those things carry a cost. And oftentimes persons forget that that cost is oftentimes carried on to the government to pay for them. However, that does not minimize the importance of the motion, and as such. Correct. Thank you. And certainly I was going to say that in a country, Mr. Speaker, where we derive no income tax from its citizens, the money that government would otherwise expend on services, whether they be health care, whether they be education or otherwise, can only be raised from its people by way of fees or otherwise. And that is why I say there is no such thing as free. Somebody eventually has to pay for it. So again, I thank the member from Bordentown West for bringing this motion, and certainly it is an issue, as the honourable member stated, is very live within the government caucus and on the discussion table. But whilst on the one hand free healthcare for children sounds ideal, the challenge for the government, as it is often the challenge in every case, is finding a solution as to how we can make it affordable and sustainable for this country. I do, Mr. Speaker, wish to address certain remarks from the member from Georgetown Central, who suggested in his contribution that the government of the day has done little or nothing to reduce the cost of living. Whilst I agree with him to the extent that if we were to accept free healthcare for children, it would certainly reduce the costs for the families who pay for healthcare today. But the statement that the government has not done anything at its midterm to reduce the cost of living is an incorrect statement, and I wish to address it. I am not yielding.
Mr. Speaker,
Unless he has a point of order specific to a standing order, I'm not
What is
yielding.
the point of order?
a matter of clarity, Mr. Speaker. I did not say.
The point of clarity is not a point of order.
Mr. Speaker, my apologies for stating the wrong point of order, but he's misrepresenting what I said.
Well, but if misrepresentation can be interpreted, will the member give
No,
way?
I will not give way.
The member has not given way.
Mr. Speaker, it is important that the record reflect what the government has done to address the issue of cost of living. And I think, first and foremost, Mr. Speaker, this is the second administration, and I say the second because we are a coalition government of national unity that is made up in majority of members that were the administration prior to this term. This is the second government administration, Mr. Speaker, that has taken the decision not to increase fees on any government services across the board, particularly those services in which the public derive a benefit from. That, Mr. Speaker, though subtle, works or lends itself to not increasing the cost of living or the burden on our citizens. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Commerce, Planning and Infrastructure, vis-a-vis the Department of Commerce and Investment, have charged no trade and business fees to micro and small businesses. Again, Mr. Speaker, encouraging the government mantra to support small and medium-sized businesses, to support entrepreneurial activities, which, I might add, earns Caymanians more money. We have increased, Mr. Speaker, the poor relief payments that are extended to seamen, veterans, persons with disability, indigents, and otherwise most vulnerable, to $200 more per month by our midterm. A $100 increase in January 2018, a $100 increase in January 2019. So we are putting more hands, Mr. Speaker, more money, Mr. Speaker, into the hands of those who need it the most. Members will certainly recall, and I can attest with great satisfaction, that we were successful in fulfilling and following through on a promise made almost 2 years ago, and that is the debt forgiveness that has been afforded to a great many citizens as it relates to back fees owed on their vehicles. Some will say the government is giving up significant revenue to do so. The government feels that we understand the challenges that our people feel, and something as little or as big, depending on who's having the conversation, as a back license tax means a lot to families struggling to find food to put in the fridge or money to pay for their mortgage. So again, the government recognizes the challenges upon which our citizens live their day to day and has taken bold steps in order to help to reduce those costs. So therefore, the statement that the government has done nothing to reduce the cost of living is incorrect. Finally, Mr. Speaker, under this administration, the unity government has also expanded the benefits available to the first-time Caymanian homeowner by reducing or removing the duty and fees that would otherwise be charged on the purchase of land, particularly first-time Caymanian homeowners. So yes, we're reducing their costs and we're giving them opportunities for ownership through small and medium-sized businesses, and we're giving them opportunities for ownership for a piece of the rock by way of first-time Caymanian homeowners. Yes, there is more that can be done, and yes, there is more that will be done, Mr. Speaker. But the remarks that the government is doing nothing to reduce those costs is incorrect, and I thank you for the time to consider these remarks.
Does any other member wish to speak? The Honorable the Minister of Infrastructure and Commerce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I won't be too long. I just felt compelled to raise a few points on the motion before us. Mr. Speaker, perhaps we should be looking at the process that we do have in place rather than talking about a blanket free health care for children. This is not when we grew up and we got free health care. That's when we were talking about 16,000, 20,000 people. Today's population made up of many, many people who can afford health care for their children, businesses that can afford health care, participation by their employees. To simply say that we want to do free health care for children, I think in today's economy, perhaps that may work. But further down the road, I'm concerned that then we will start eating into the quality of the health care that we'll be providing. We have a system at the Needs Assessment Unit where you're assessed, and then you can get cynical insurance for your kids, yourself, if you need it. I think we need to focus on fixing that system, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the issues surrounding that are simple. We see it every day. At least certainly I see it every week in my constituency clinic. You have been assessed, you're unemployed, and you're receiving help. Your children are being insured through Cynical, and then you receive a job at $6 or $7 an hour, and then automatically you lose your assistance. This is the issue we're running into. You get a job for $6 or $7 an hour, you have to get a babysitter, you have to pay for uniform, you got to pay pensions, you have to participate in insurance, and at the end of the week, you've had a net loss of $25 or $30. It makes no sense to go to work. And then on top of that, you've lost your help from the government. I think that is the issue, Mr. Speaker. That is where we need to focus our attention. Mr. Speaker, we have an old saying that says, you get what you pay for. And I think that is true. I think that is true in education. I think that would be true in health care if we just simply said free health care, as we say, free education. There are many of us that participate in the education process that can afford to pay for their education. And so I think we need to look at the process that we use to assess who receives free health care or who receives free education. Because today the government can afford it. But 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road, as the population grows, and it's not growing simply from us Caymanians having children. It's growing exponentially based on the economy. But when that economy drops, will we see the same amount of people leave the country? We don't know. And if we are to pick up the tab for all of these persons, for all of us, all Caymanians, it doesn't matter whether you were born here like myself or whether you came here like my father. You're all Caymanians. And so, Mr. Speaker, whilst I support it, I certainly support finding a solution to the scenarios that we face on a daily basis with our constituents. And I leave very heavy-hearted on several evenings after my constituency clinic, trying to figure out how to help persons that their kids that have, some of them have chronic diseases, learning disabilities, behavioral disabilities, you name it, and they don't have the insurance to be able to receive the help they need. But I believe that what we have to do is to work on the system that identifies those individuals and to ensure that we continue to help them. To give someone help today, and because you get a $6 an hour job tomorrow to say you don't need the help, it's crazy. And not only our children, our elderly. To look at a 65 and 70-year-old and say, okay, you need help today, you need insurance coverage, but we're only going to do it for 6 months. You think they're going to win the lottery? It's illegal here. They're not going to go out and land a job for $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year. Their position isn't going to change in 6 months. But we continue to do this over and over and over again. So, Mr. Speaker, while I know there is a need, I just wonder if we're looking in the wrong direction or looking at what I would consider a short-term fix, because later on down the road we'll have to find a way to fund it. But perhaps we need to look at the system that we already have in place to help these individuals and fix that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? The Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I just want to offer another little, I shouldn't say a little, another perspective, or that's probably wrong too. To talk about another side of this equation. I endorse what all of the members on my side have said relating to this matter, and the point that the Minister for Infrastructure and other things just made, I think, is so important, and one we've talked about before. So before I actually go from address my perspective, I want to say a few words about that. And that is that the cost of health care provision across the developed world continues to be one of the greatest challenges of almost every nation. How do you provide quality health care at costs that either the government or people in the private sector or a combination of the two are able to afford? So what we are facing in Cayman is nothing new or unprecedented. I do believe, though, that in many ways we are better placed than most countries to be able to address this because of the size and relative wealth of the country. As hard and as challenging as many of our people here feel it, we are without question the most economically advantaged country in the entire region. So I believe, as I say, we are better placed to be able to come up with solutions which are able to afford to our people what the mover of this motion and everybody who's spoken are seeking, which is equal access to quality health care by all of our people, regardless of what their particular financial circumstances may be. We have a unique taxation system, not many countries in the world have a taxation system where there is no form of direct taxation. There is no payroll tax, there's no income tax, there's no land holding tax, and the list goes on and on. These are all expenses which citizens or even residents of most countries in the world have to pay. So, as well off as we think government revenues are, the reality is that the construct that we have, and I'm not suggesting we change it, means that while the country is generally well off, government is relatively poor because its sources of revenue are quite limited. The truth of the matter is, if government had to rely on the fees and taxes which are generated as a result of local people, what we are able to do in terms of the provision of services and infrastructure to our people would be very, very limited. And this is not some sort of speculation on my part. I know what life was like in Cayman when I was growing up in the 60s and early 70s. I know how poor we were and how little government provided and how little government had of its own means to provide. I am old enough to remember when government still had to borrow money from private businesses to be able to meet its obligations on occasion. Can anyone conceive of that in this day and age? Where government couldn't even pay civil servants because it didn't have enough money. Had to borrow money from Marines. So, what has given us the ability to do what we do and the relative wealth that we have has been inward investment and the establishment of businesses which do largely international work, and the fees generated as a result of companies' registrations and mutual funds registrations and work permit fees and all of those things. So, Mr. Speaker, it is the easiest thing to say that government should do more. And Lord, every one of us in here knows that we hear that every day. Why government don't do this and why government don't do that. But government has to have the means to do it. And that is why we who are elected, and particularly those of us who are in government, must be constantly looking to see what it is that government can do to broaden its revenue base, find means to make to insulate, as far as that is possible, its revenue streams from external impacts and the potential loss of revenue. Find means to diversify the economy so the risks of major revenue loss are lessened. Why government has to constantly strive to do things to attract more inward investment. Because without the constant generation, and given the way that Cayman is growing, and given the demands and expectations of our population for these kinds of services, government has to continually strive to increase its revenue streams. Otherwise, we can't fund all of these important social programs and measures. And I say this, Mr. Speaker, which I hope will help new members of this House and the broader public to appreciate, in the sense of, using that word in the sense of understand, why it is that we need new investment, why it is we need new industries, why it is we need to ensure that we don't do rash things that discourage investment, that have the effect of reducing the amount of visitors who come here. As an example, because it is only through that continued growth of revenue that we are able to provide social programs, make concessions which help our people. Concessions such as those we have recently made by passing legislation in this House to increase the value of property which Caymanian homeowners, first-time Caymanian homeowners, are able to acquire without paying any stamp duty, raising the ceiling on the value of the purchase of land to $200,000, and land on which there is a building to $400,000, no stamp duty at all. Those are the sorts of measures that a government can take to help its people when its revenue streams are as good as they are now. If government was in the bind that it was in when we took office for the first time some 6 years ago, we couldn't do those sorts of things. So, Mr. Speaker, there is an unfortunate tendency in some on the opposition benches, not all, to rail against every measure that the government proposes to create new economic activity on the basis is that they're doing this for foreigners. What about the Caymanians? We have to start thinking, those of us who are charged with the responsibility of representing this country, that this is not a country that is bifurcated, where we can say, this is the foreigners, this is the local people. We're doing this for the local people, we're not doing this for the foreigners. We have developed a country that is so successful, and because it has understood this symbiotic relationship that is necessary between those of us who are of this place and those of us who have come to this place. The challenge always is to get this balance right, so that as the country develops and grows and people come here and make a good living, come here, invest and make a good profit, that we as a people benefit overall from that growth and development. And while I hear all the time, as I'm sure you do too, Mr. Speaker, oh, Caymanians not getting this and Caymanians getting left behind, I don't have to ask anybody about that. Because when I was born, the population was 8,500 people. I remember when electricity went to East End and North Side. I remember when we got telephones that you had them in your house in 1966 for the first time. And that was in East End and North Side and Bontown Island, that was Georgetown and West Bay. So, right, exactly. Right. So I was a big boy when East End got electricity. I remember when the proper road ended Pease Bay, and it was just a mile track with potholes and washboard. The old people used to say, because the car go like do. That's how bad the road was. When there was not a street light from Pease Bay to Northside or East End. Mr. Speaker, my generation is the first generation that were able, on any sort of I can't even say universal basis, to get access to tertiary education. Only the very wealthy, and there weren't too many of them in Cayman, were able to send their children to school, principally to Jamaica. One or two went to the States, but right. So my father generation left school at 14 if they were good. If they were good academically. If they weren't good academically, they'd gone long before that. So, Mr. Speaker, I say all of these things in contribution to a motion about seeking for the government to consider the provision of free health care to children. And some may say that that is, that this is far from the subject. It is not, in the sense that what I'm trying to paint in terms of a picture, principally for the benefit of younger people, is that the ability to do these sorts of things and to provide these sorts of services is tied to the overall success of the economy, which in turn is what gives government, given our tax system, the ability to provide these services. When I was growing up, most people never thought about government for any assistance because government was so poor. I never grew up hearing people saying, well, I don't know why government do this or government don't do that. Nobody expected government to do it because government didn't have the ability to do it. Yeah, right. So it's important. It's really important that we appreciate, even in the rough and tumble of politics and the disagreements over policy, which is a natural part of the political process, that we all agree. We might disagree about how we go about certain things or about priorities, but we all bear in mind that this country has come to where it's come because of a range of factors, and that we can't constantly be thinking that we're doing this for the foreigners, and we shouldn't be doing it for the foreigners, and we should be doing it for the Caymanians. And we divide our thinking in that sort of way without appreciating that we all contribute to the success this place is, and we might argue about, as I say, about priorities. But let us not in the process go down the road, the divisive road that so many other countries, and particularly countries in the region, have gone, and some are still going. And as a result, let this place become less attractive to those who would come and invest and visit and do business here, and in consequence of all of that, make the country as a whole better off, government better off, so that government can continue to improve the social conditions, programs, and opportunities of our own people. Mr. Speaker, this is a great little country. I sent to you, Mr. Speaker, yesterday a graph which had been sent to me by a friend who is attending the Caribbean Development Bank meeting currently underway in Port of Spain, Trinidad, in which they're looking at essentially the state of the economies of the region. And the note, the graph which she sent me says, of all the countries that are there, Cayman is the only country in the Caribbean that saw a decline in its multi-dimensional vulnerability, economic, social, environmental, from 2016 to 2017. Mr. Speaker, The countries are Anguilla, Antigua and Barbuda, Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Cayman Islands, Dominica, Grenada, Guyana, Haiti, Jamaica, Montserrat, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago. So, Mr. Speaker, we have a lot to be proud of and a lot to be thankful for. Our economic model is working and working well. And this is not an economic model which I or my administration have come up with. Cayman has, over the course of my lifetime, pushing close to 60 years now, continued an upward trajectory in terms of its growth and development. Yes, there have been troughs along the way, as you would expect, but overall, the conditions in this country, the opportunities in this country for our people have continued to improve. So I urge us all to continue working to preserve and improve upon the model that we have in terms of our economics, so that we are able to broaden the social programs that the government is able to offer and to help as many of our people by giving them the necessary ability and opportunities to climb the economic and social ladder in this country. Just to quickly address before I close, Mr. Speaker, the point about the cost of living. In a country where the vast majority of everything you consume is imported, the ability to control the cost of living is very, very limited. Because the merchants import at whatever prices they're able to get, and they sell at those prices plus their margin of profit. Government has little control over that particularly in terms of food. Because again, Mr. Speaker, for the benefit of the general public and some newer members here, over the course of the last, I would say, 25 years, government after government, administration after administration has taken off the import duty on virtually all foodstuffs that are imported to these islands, so that almost everything except the sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Not exotic, but the specialty foods, prime rib and them sorts of things, still attract some form of duty. But the staples that we consume, there is no duty on it. So government's room to maneuver in terms of, we're going to do this to reduce the cost of living is very, very limited. Mr. Speaker, what government, we have, and we've talked about it before, government has reduced the import duty on fuel for the purposes of generating electricity from, when we took office, from 75 cents a gallon to 25. Those sorts of measures. But what government can do, Mr. Speaker, which is what this government has striven not to do, we can significantly increase the cost of living. Because anything that we do to raise fees and taxes or duties has an immediate knock-on effect right across the economy. And unfortunately, when government reduces duties, you may not see an immediate reaction of merchants. But you can believe if government were to increase it before it was even passed or it came into effect, there'd be a reaction at the pumps, at the gas station, or at the counter, the cashier, checkout in the supermarkets. So we have striven, and it is now 6 years, to avoid increasing any fees and taxes. Mr. Speaker, I don't expect that that's going to be able to go on indefinitely. But the only way that it can is if the volumes of business continue to increase, so that you can keep the fees where they are and still generate enough, because inflation undermines the value of of the money that you're using to buy whatever it is you're buying. And if your inflation costs start to increase too much, then regardless of how many cost of living increases government gives or the private sector give, the value of the money is still not what it would otherwise be. So you have to bear all of these factors in mind. And this government is working hard to try to balance all of these issues, Mr. Speaker. We are happy to take this motion on board. It is something we've been considering anyhow, and it's good to know that we have the support of the opposition for it. But we've had this discussion here before about, as I said, the cost of the overall provision of health care. And so we have to look at all of this in the round and not just in an ad hoc sort of way, because it would make us all feel good to be able to say that all children in Cayman have free health care. We have to bear in mind how the government is going to fund this, not just now, but for the long term. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your patience and your attention to my submission.
Yes, you were up my alley. Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Call now on the mover for his right of reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the Honorable Minister of Health and the member for Bordentown East for accepting the motion on the government's behalf. And I also want to thank the Honorable Premier for his contribution. And while it may not be politically correct to say what I'm about to say, the majority of what the Premier said is actually correct. And I guess they can probably use that in some campaign video sometime around. But that's fine. And the thing about it is, Mr. Speaker, when I wrote this motion, Mr. Speaker, you members would realize that this is a motion that was carried forward from the previous session. I was very deliberate in the wording I chose for the motion, and I have to also give my colleague from Savannah, Mr. Eden, the original second of the motion in terms of the discussion that we had surrounding this motion, and I was able to benefit from his experience as a previous Minister of Health. The truth of the fact is, Mr. Speaker, even during my contribution, I was deliberate in not bringing in the cost issue or even the profits and everything that the insurance companies were making on the healthcare industry. And the reason being, Mr. Speaker, is, as an accountant, we're taught, to be careful that we know the cost of everything and the price of nothing. I didn't bring this motion even though the benefits would be savings to families. I brought this motion for one simple reason, Mr. Speaker. It was the right thing to do. I, and like many other members in this House, are products of a time when the government heavily invested in its people. I can probably safe to say that my generation was probably the generation that probably got the most investment to some extent. Back then, Mr. Speaker, when we got scholarships, we were literally guaranteed jobs when we came back from school. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, one of the things that gave me pause as I was looking at this motion, and during my contribution, I spoke about my firstborn son. What most people didn't realize, Mr. Speaker, is that when I came back from school at the time, there wasn't a job readily available for me at the time in the public service. And at that time, they said, you know what, I can go to one of the accounting firms and get some experience and wait for my call to come back, because jobs back then wasn't hard for accountants to get. And during the course of that job, Mr. Speaker, I got married and my wife became pregnant. And during that time, I got a call from government saying, well, Chris, we have a position for you right now. You can come, we have a job for you. So I quit my job and getting ready to return to the public service. Mr. Speaker, when I went to pick up my letter, they were paying me. What they were offering me was $1,700 less than what the current post holder was getting at the time. And I said to them, well, here's what I'm making now. Match this and I can work, but I ain't working for that. They said, well, this is what we pay returning graduates. I said, well, I'm no longer a returning graduate. I have a little bit of experience now. I start preparing for my CPA exam, so I can't sign that. Well, Chris, you have to sign it. I said, actually, no. I ain't signing nothing. I said, if I am to sign that letter, it means that the money you have invested to send me off in the school would have been wasted, because clearly I'd have been stupid to have signed it. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, what Chris didn't realize back then, nor Shawnette at the time, who wasn't working, that with she being pregnant, she had what you call a pre-existing condition. And Chris was caught out with absolutely no insurance. If I'd known that I'd taken a job, got the insurance, I had my baby born and then quit. But I didn't do that. And I decided to stand my ground and end up paying out of pocket for my first child to be born. And if anyone have an idea how expensive it is in terms of a child being born, I can tell you it is expensive. But I learned my lesson the hard way. I say all of that to say, Mr. Speaker, last weekend when I dusted off this speech that I prepared from the previous sitting, and I started looking back at my original submission, what changed it from what I delivered earlier was when I was preparing for the civil debate, and I started looking at how fragile our economy is with regards to how we derive our revenues and everything else. And there is a serious mismatch in this country with regards to how our taxes are raised and also how we spend our money. It is, as the Premier pointed out, something that has to be seriously looked at. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, I also had to take into consideration that if this motion was to be successful, and considering that we have a mortality rate now of 82 years of age, it means that a child being born today is expected to live at least 82 years. And God knows what the mortality rate may move to, even 10 years from now. Because the truth of the fact is our people are living longer than most of them can actually save for during their working life. I say all of that to say, Mr. Speaker, that I really didn't want to get into the whole cost issue, benefit issue, but what I wanted to more get from this motion is what we believe our responsibility as political leaders to be, and what as a country would expect, as a country what we would want. One of the things I also took into consideration, Mr. Speaker, in terms of drafting the motion, and I'm sorry my colleague from Savannah isn't here, is a look at what happened in the U.S. with Obamacare, where the Democrats had used their majority after the 2008 election to push an initiative through that did not have bipartisan support. And as you can see, with the government, well, with the Congress being changed to Republican and now the White House, you can see the pushback on the Affordable Care Act. And this is what happens when politics comes into issues such as these. There are some things we have to agree, Mr. Speaker, that cannot be politics in this House. We have enough differences and we have enough things to argue about. And that's the reason why I restrain from getting into the cost issue, the money issue, and the saving issue to families, because at the end of the day, this is more a matter of principle and what we as a country must decide what we want and what we would like the Cayman Islands to look like 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now and beyond. Mr. Speaker, the government side had raised the issue in terms of what we have today. But we also have to consider, and I am really pleased of where we are as a country in its financial position, because clearly we have learned a lot from what has happened in the past. I mean, up to 10 years ago, we had a situation where the country was in serious financial issues as a result of the great financial crisis at the time. And we have recovered well. We have not gone out and done anything really crazy. We haven't done anything really major to basically expose the country to anything that we can probably say is going to be a serious problem down the road. I looked at the third quarter report. I saw the amount of cash accumulation. And I think for a country of this size, it's actually quite commendable. Look at where revenues are and everything else. But it has always come down to a matter of priority. And one of the things that we need to make sure is that we keep as a focus also, why is it that we're doing what we're doing? And we do what we do for the Caymanian people. We have seniors right now that are getting ready to retire. And one of the issues, and this is one of the issues that are near and dear to me, and I know other members in this House share the same thing also, is I look at those who would have been coming to retirement age now, considering that the pension plan that we have in place is around 20 years old. And for those employed in the private sector, working in 20 years, you would have only, in essence, saved 2 years' worth of salary at a 10% contribution rate. And then when you factor what has happened during the financial crisis, you realize that half, if not more than their pension would have been wiped out, and they would not have had time to recover. These are people now that are coming into retirement. I can hazard a guess that their premiums will be well in excess of $1,000, but we have a pension law that basically limits their, I think, drawings even $1,080 a month. So these are the challenges that we have facing the country, where we recognize that healthcare cost is growing faster than most people's income. And this is not a situation of something that we can take very lightly. And one of the things, I mean, while we're discussing it, and again, I thank my colleague from Savannah who isn't here, but could have drawn from his experience as a former minister, is even the implementation of this. I wouldn't expect overnight that the government was going to get up and just say all children free. We can probably look at a phase approach and say, you know, we're going to do the first 7 years, then maybe we'll do the first 12 years, gradually, bit by bit, piece by piece, until we get what it is we want. And then also look at the other vulnerable members that we have in society. But one of the things that we in this House have got to be careful of is we get into the old political battle sometimes on some issues that we just know we all agree on, but we just have not figured out the best way to do it. And that's one of the reasons why the motion is as generic and as bare as it came, as to not to get into anything else other than, you know what, we know we need to do right by our people. We have a responsibility to our people. Let us start somewhere. As I said in my contribution, Mr. Speaker, what I was hoping for more than anything is the ability for us to probably reset the clock. We have recognized that we have already made mistakes along the way, and there's not much we can do except to learn from those mistakes. And if we can say, you know what, let us start back here, look at these vulnerable members within our society, and see what it is that we can do. And if things change, we can start looking at it over and over. But ultimately, you're looking at a minimum, if we even look at this, something that's going to go probably 18 years in the future to start looking at. And these are the kind of things you have to consider. And the truth of the fact, Mr. Speaker, as I said in my earlier contribution, none of us in this House has the knowledge, the expertise, nor the skill set to find a solution. The only thing that this House can provide is the will to get it done. And that is what I wanted from this motion, is for us to find the will to do right by the Caymanian people, and more importantly, our children, who we refer to as our future. That is the only thing that we can do as politicians in this House. This is a very complex issue. It is not clear-cut. It is not cookie-cut. It is an issue that requires a lot of technical skill, a lot of technical experience. And thus the reason why I tried my best to not get into all of the other minutiae and everything else. But for us to just agree that this is a priority, this is something we need to do. Let us now get the right people, find the right people, put them in a room together for them to find a solution. This is all we're looking for. And also at the same time to let the Caymanian people know that, yes, we do recognize that this is an issue. Yes, we didn't get here overnight, but you know what? We recognize that this is a problem, and we want to do what we can do. We're going to do our best to try to find a solution. And it may not come in one fell swoop, but it can come in over time. We can start even up to year 5 or age 5 or whatever, but at least demonstrate to the Caymanian people that we have some will, and we have some willingness to recognize that this is an issue, and let's see where we can start. So it's not about going from 0 straight to 23. You know, this is something, and this is what I would have expected an approach to be, where we start looking at what it is that we can set aside. I'm also mindful of the other liabilities that the government have already been exposed to. There's an unfunded unfunded healthcare liability. I think the last time I saw a number was about 1.7 billion, which is what we have already committed to over the next 20 years for current and retired civil servants. I'm also cognizant that we have an unfunded pension liability that we still have to recognize. So we already have $2 billion worth of liability, Mr. Speaker, that we have already committed to. Unfunded health care and the pension, just to, when you add the two of them together. Contingent, thank you, Senior. Yeah. So you also have to recognize that. And while things may be well known and things may be good, you know, some economists are already predicting that there may be a recession next year. You know, so these are the kind of things that we just can't look and just say, you know, we're going to jump into something. Because it is those rush decisions in the past where we have ended up in some situations where we are now. And that is what it is I'm looking for. The only thing I think this honorable House needs to demonstrate to the Caymanian people is that we have the will to start dealing with this problem somewhere or the other. I know the government was looking at the 665 plan, and that's one of the reasons why, even within this motion, I didn't include the elderly, because I know something was being looked at for them. But ultimately, you know, it is still something that we need to deal with. So, Mr. Speaker, I just want to thank the government, and I want to thank the Honorable Minister and Representative from Bordentown East. This was something he campaigned on. This was something I campaigned on. And I also want to thank our other members for their contribution, because in one way or the other, whether we like it or don't like it, at least it did ash out some issues that we definitely need to tackle. My colleague from Newlands had talked about, you know, people adjusting lifestyle. And part of this can also be for us to go and educate or reemphasize to the public the importance of taking care of yourself from early, trying to avoid certain things. You have seen some countries around the world now start banning sugar and sugary drinks and all that kind of stuff. So we've already seen where some people are making changes, and these are just the things that we may have to also look at some point down the road. With that, Mr. Speaker, I just want to thank everyone else for their contribution, and at least, if anything, putting some things in context. I am sure that many members in this House and many members of the public have at least learned a little bit more about what it is that we're trying to do here. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I thank everyone.
The question is, be it therefore resolved that the government considers implementing free basic health care services for children as soon as budgetary possible. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, the ayes have it. Private members' motion number 7 is duly passed. We're close to the hour of 4:30, and I'll call on the Premier to suspend orders to continue. I think they've got some motions that they can continue with. Whichever one of you it is, it will be one of you. Call now on the Leader of the Opposition to move suspension of standing orders in order to carry on business after the hour of 4:30.
Mr. Speaker, I think in the interest of time, and because 3 of our motions will either be withdrawn or 2 are being withdrawn or deferred, and one is being all 3 are being deferred, and the other 2 we don't necessarily have to do now, but maybe it would be better if we move a closure motion.
Adjourn the House. Mr. Premier, is the Honorable Leader of the Opposition saying that we adjourn the House at this time?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, with the caveat that all our motions be carried forward.
Honorable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the outstanding motions, private members' motions on today's order paper be carried forward to the next meeting of the House.
Question is that the remaining motions on today's agenda be carried forward to the next meeting of the House. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, the ayes have it. The motions will be carried forward. Now we'll call now on the Premier for the adjournment of this Honorable House.
Mr. Speaker, we had given an indication that there would be a meeting of Finance Committee tomorrow. And so I move the adjournment.
10.
Huh? Okay. Speaker, I'm being reminded by the clerk that I need to suspend certain standing orders with respect to Mr. Speaker, just let me get it clear before
Yes.
I move anything.
Honorable Premier, perhaps you and the leader of the opposition can.
Mr. Chairman, I will leave him to do what he has to do, and with your permission, sir, I propose to do what I need to do.
Oh, yes.
So, Mr. Speaker, I move the suspension of Standing Order 24-5, which is the standing order that deals with 5 days' notice normally being required for a motion to be dealt with at this meeting, to enable a government motion to be dealt with at this meeting, that being the motion regarding the chairmanship and membership of the Public Accounts Committee as a result of the resignation of the member from Northside as chairman and a member of that committee.
Honorable Premier, are you
Just suspension of standing order, that's all I'm doing.
you're just suspending at this time, not taking it further than that
No, we leave it at the end of
meeting?
the
Question is that standing orders 24-5 be suspended. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, the ayes have it. Standing orders 24 will be is suspended when the House begins next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The leader of the opposition wishes to bring a motion regarding the Business Committee. The Business Committee is fully constituted and there are no vacancies.
Premier, not to stop you in your thought process, but are we seeking to do that now or tomorrow?
No, sir, I'm just signaling what the member has indicated to me. So a way will have to be found to accommodate that at the end of the business tomorrow. I'm just signaling and acknowledging that I have heard what he said.
Okay.
And so, Mr. Speaker, without more, I adjourn the business of this House until the completion of Finance Committee. Tomorrow morning, Finance Committee will start at 10 a.m.
Question is that
Mr.
Honorable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Premier for that, but to find a way, it is an easy way. The standing orders makes provisions for revocation and appointments to any committee.
And I would think that by tomorrow, the Honorable Leader of the Opposition will have pardoned his motion.
Oh, I read it, but they tell me I couldn't do it.
The question is then that the Honorable House do stand adjourned until the completion of Finance Committee tomorrow. All in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. This Honorable Assembly stands adjourned until tomorrow at the completion of Finance Committee when the House will reconvene.